Raheem Sterling has been one of the more unique-looking styled footballers of his generation. At his peak, he was one of the most explosive players in world football. Defenders hated to face him because he had this electric acceleration, his movement was unpredictable, and while most people analyze the players through tactics, statistics, and the psychology of the player, today we're going to actually look at something very different and analyze something very different. I want to analyze his movements because when you start looking closely at Sterling's posture, his running mechanics, his breathing mechanics, you begin to notice movement strategy is very different here to many footballers. Now, before we get into this, this is not a diagnosis. This is not me saying this caused any injury. This is not saying this explains the state of his current state of his career or anything like that. This is simply just a biomechanical case study. The first thing that we notice that appears is this anterior pelvic tilt. In simple terms, the pelvis is simply tipped forward. Now, the internet will love to tell you this is bad, and like any postural position, it isn't inherently bad or inherently good. It's just whether or not you can come in or out of it is where you lie on the spectrum of bad. I don't think it's simple just to say that footballers need this extension, sprinters need this extension. Elite athletes in general often spend a large portion of competition in extension. So the real question isn't, is anterior pelvic tilt bad? The real question is, can the athlete move out of this when they need to? Because movement isn't about position, it's about options. Now, before we talk about potential limitations, let's talk about why the athlete might adopt this strategy in the first place. Because every movement strategy solves a problem. The pelvis tips forward, the body's center of mass shifts forward as well. The athlete is effectively falling slightly ahead of themselves. Every step then becomes an attempt to catch themselves. That's one reason why athletes can look incredibly explosive. They're not just pushing forwards. They're falling forwards and they're catching themselves repeatedly. If you watch Sterling sprint, especially during those years in Liverpool and Man City, then this is exactly what you see. Almost as though he's being pulled forward and pulled down towards the pitch. Almost like he's constantly chasing his center of mass. That forward orientation strategy may have contributed to some major acceleration mechanics that have made him so dangerous when he was going forward. Sterling isn't the only footballer that uses this strategy or you see this strategy in. Messi is actually a very interesting example of this. Now, Messi's mechanics are different. If you look carefully, you often see him shift into this forward orientation of his hips. The difference is that Messi seems to be able to move in and out of this anterior pelvic tilt exceptionally well. He can drop into flexion, rotate, compress, then explode back into this extension. And that's one of the reasons why he's so difficult to contend with when he's going forward. Not because he stays in one position, because he can access many different ones. That's really the entire theme of this video. If you watch nothing else, you need to understand that elite movement isn't about finding the perfect posture. It's about being able to access multiple movement options. The second thing to notice is what appears to be this elevated ribcage. Notice how the chest appears to lift. Notice how the shoulders appear to move backwards. A lot of people would look at this and simply call this good posture. But biomechanics isn't always this straightforward. If the ribs stay elevated, the shoulder blades sit compressed against the back part of the rib cage, you can potentially lose some of the ability to extend through the posterior part of the chest wall. In simple English, you lose some of the ability to breathe into your back. This is where breathing and moving are connected. Because the rib cage isn't just a breathing structure, it's also a movement structure. Actually, 80% of your movement comes from good breathing mechanics. So every breath changes the shape of your rib cage, and every change of the rib cage shape influences how you can move. Football isn't just sprinting, it isn't just accelerating or decelerating, turning, rotating, recovery, changing directions, producing force, absorbing force. There are lots of different actions and requirements of movement, and it's so variable for football athletes. The athlete that just knows one strategy to do any of these things runs into problems quite quickly. The athletes who can move between strategies often is the one to be able to solve these problems and these variabilities during the game. Again, this isn't about perfect posture, it's about adaptability. Now let's talk about injury risk, and I want to be very, very careful here. I'm not saying anterior pelvic tilt causes injuries. Football injuries are an incredibly complex subject, but there is some interesting research. One study following professional footballers found that anterior pelvic tilt was associated with higher frequency of hamstring injuries. That doesn't prove causation, so don't go taking that away from this video, but it does give a rise to an interesting question. One possible explanation is that the pelvis remains in this tipped forward position, so the hamstrings begin in an already elongated position. And when we ask them to sprint, accelerate, decelerate, and repeat those actions hundreds of times over a week, even just during a game, this could influence how that load is distributed through the system. And possibly, that's where you look at some of these hamstring injuries that Sterling's experienced through his career, makes this an interesting conversation. This isn't a conclusion. This is a conversation, remember. And this is where I think the posture conversation can go quite wrong. People simply want answers, good, bad, right, wrong, but really athletes are more complicated than that. The same movement strategy that may contribute to this explosiveness can also have trade-offs. Important thing is to understand both sides of this equation. So was anterior pelvic tilt responsible for Raheem Sterling's successes? No. Was it responsible for the injuries he's had? We can't say that either. But what Sterling gives is a fascinating example of how elite athletes develop movement strategies. And the lesson isn't that posture is wrong or this is good or a bad posture. The lesson is that every athlete develops preferences. The question is, can they access something different when the game demands it of them? Can they move into this flexion? Can they move back into extension? Can they rotate? Can they compress? Can they expand? Because ultimately, being an elite athlete, being at your elite performance, isn't about finding the perfect posture. It's about having more movement options available than the person trying to stop you. And that's what makes biomechanics and breathing biomechanics such an interesting subject. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope we've broken down and looked at some of the interesting stuff about Raheem Sterling. Again, this isn't a conclusion. This isn't to say good or bad. This is merely just a case study to look at this anterior pelvic tilt, this compression of the upper shoulders, and does it make a difference? Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. It's absolutely free, but it means the world to me if you do it. And I hope you really enjoyed this video. Comment below your thoughts. Comment below your thoughts on Raheem Sterling, what we've covered here. And if there's anyone else you want me to look at in terms of this biomechanics and breathing biomechanics, then name that athlete below and I'll see what I can do. No promises, but I just thought it's an interesting case study, not to conclude anything, not to say anything's good or bad, but it's good to look at these kinds of things and talk about them more. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you all again very soon.